April 1945, Bavaria. His hands were trembling. The 12-year-old German boy stood at the edge of the ruined street in Bavaria, watching the olive-drab column emerge through the smoke. For 3 years, the Hitler Youth leaders had hammered it into his skull. The Americans were subhumans, degenerate enemies, monsters who would rape, murder, and enslave. He had seen the propaganda posters. They weren't human at all, just caricatures of evil in military uniforms. The tanks rolled closer. The grinding of metal on cobblestone echoed through the empty town. The boy held his breath. This was it. This was the moment he'd been trained to fear. This was the instant when everything he'd been taught would be proven true. Then one soldier stopped, dusty, weathered, scarred by a war that had aged him beyond his years. The American looked down at the terrified child whose face had gone white, white like the faces in the newsreels, white like those poor devils who knew they were about to meet death. The soldier smiled, small, faint, but a smile. Then he held out his hand. On his palm sat a chocolate bar. American chocolate, impossible chocolate, Hershey. The kind that didn't exist in Germany anymore. The kind the Nazi regime had promised would never reach them. The kind that symbolized everything about American decadence and weakness. The boy's entire world began to crack. In an instant, a single act of human kindness accomplished what no weapon could. It reached deeper than fear. It pierced through every lie, every indoctrination, every lesson learned in the Hitler Youth. It proved that the enemy was human. It proved that mercy existed. And most terrifyingly, for the Nazi ideology that had raised him, it proved that they had been lied to about everything. This is the story of how a bar of chocolate became more powerful than a bullet, how American humanity defeated Nazi mythology, and how the greatest psychological victory of 1945 came not from weapons, but from generosity. The spring melt had turned the roads to mud. 15-year-old Klaus Bergman crouched in the cellar of his parents' house, listening to the sound of artillery getting closer, hour by hour, sometimes minute by minute. The windows had blown out weeks ago. The neighbor's house was gone. Just rubble now, gray and meaningless against the overcast sky. Klaus wore the uniform of the Hitler Youth. The brown shirt hung loose on his frame. He'd lost 30 pounds since January. Around his neck still hung the medal commemorating 4 years of service to the Fuhrer. In his pocket was a pamphlet, creased and worn, that he'd read so many times the words had burned themselves into his memory. "The Anglo-American invasion is the beginning of the end for Bolshevik Jew plutocracy," it read. "But it is also the beginning for you, the Hitlerjugend, to prove yourselves as the shields of the German people. The enemy soldiers are not like us. They are inferior races driven by Jewish conspiracy to destroy Germanic civilization. Show them the strength of youth. Show them the invincibility of the Aryan spirit." He believed it then. All 15 years of his life had prepared him to believe it. From the age of 10, Klaus had marched in formations every Sunday. He'd sung the songs, not just sung them, but bellowed them, feeling the power of thousands of young voices, unified in purpose. Today Germany belongs to us, tomorrow the whole world. The old men in their gray suits had nodded approvingly. The teachers had given him better grades when he recited Nazi racial theory. His parents, when they dared speak, seemed proud but frightened. The Hitler Youth was everything. It was family, religion, philosophy, and purpose rolled into one brown uniform. When the war started, Klaus was only 9 years old. He barely remembered the before times. To him, the war had always existed. Hitler had always existed. The righteous struggle against the Jews and the Bolsheviks and the plutocrats had always been the only reality. The bombs changed things, though. The bombs made it harder to believe. In January, the Americans and British had dropped nearly 900 tons of explosives on the region over 2 days. Klaus had watched the mushroom clouds rise over nearby towns. He'd helped dig bodies out of rubble. He'd held a woman's hand as she died from wounds so severe that no doctor could have saved her. He'd seen children, younger than him, charred beyond recognition. The propaganda film showed these destruction as proof of enemy desperation. "They cannot defeat us in combat," the narrator had screamed, "so they turn to terror against civilians. This proves their weakness. This proves that victory is ours." But Klaus had started to wonder, if victory was ours, why did everything keep getting worse? By April, the rumors were everywhere. The Soviets had crossed the Oder River. The Americans were in the Rhine Valley. The British were advancing from the north, and nobody was winning anymore. The Wehrmacht commanders were giving strange orders: hold to the last man, die for the Fuhrer, never surrender. Klaus had been given a rifle. It was old, probably from the First World War. He had no ammunition. He'd attended 3 days of military training. The instructor, a one-armed SS veteran with a scar running down his face, had taught them how to throw themselves under tanks with explosives taped to their chests. "This is honor," the veteran had said, his eye blazing with fervor. "This is how we defeat the enemy, with sacrifice, with blood." Klaus didn't feel honored. He felt sick, but he kept the rifle. He wore the uniform. And when his mother begged him to leave, to run to the countryside, he refused. A true German fighter didn't abandon his post. That's what they'd taught him. The alternative to duty was cowardice. The alternative to fighting was betraying your race. And then, on a cold morning in early April, everything changed. Not the war. The war was ending, but his entire understanding of what that war meant. The Americans came on a Tuesday morning when the mist was still thick over the Danube. Klaus heard them first, a deep grinding sound like the earth was splitting open. Tanks. American tanks, he thought. His heart hammered against his ribs. He looked at the rifle in his hands. It felt suddenly very small and very light. His mother was upstairs packing. His father was gone. Died at Stalingrad in 1943. So many years ago that Klaus sometimes had trouble remembering his face. His sister had been evacuated to a farm in the country. It was just him and his mother now. "Klaus!" His mother's voice was sharp, panicked. "Come up." He climbed the cellar stairs. Through the blown-out window, he could see the lead tank rumbling down the street, its turret rotating slowly, searching for threats. Soldiers hung off the sides of the following vehicles, their faces dark with dirt and smoke. These were men who had been fighting for days without stopping. These were the monsters from the propaganda films. They didn't look like monsters. They looked exhausted. They looked like soldiers. They looked, Klaus thought with a shock that made him grip his rifle tighter, like they could be anyone, like they could be my neighbor, like they could be my uncle. One of them saw the house, saw Klaus at the window. The American's hand went to his weapon. Klaus's mother screamed. She ran down the stairs and yanked Klaus away from the window. They crouched together behind the kitchen table as footsteps thundered through the house. The kitchen door flew open. An American soldier stood in the doorway, rifle raised. He was enormous. His uniform was stained with blood. Not his own, Klaus realized with slow horror. He had dark eyes and a 3-day beard and a scar running along his jawline. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the American lowered his rifle. He looked at Klaus, really looked at him, seeing the child under the uniform, seeing the fear. "There's a kid," the soldier called over his shoulder, his accent butchering the sound of everything Klaus had ever heard. "Just a kid." Another soldier appeared behind him, this one younger, maybe 20. He saw Klaus's rifle and reached down, gently taking it. Klaus didn't resist. He couldn't have resisted. His arms felt numb. "You speak English?" the older soldier asked in slow, careful words. Klaus shook his head. The soldier reached into his breast pocket. Klaus watched, expecting a pistol, expecting the end. The soldier pulled out a chocolate bar. Not propaganda chocolate, the thin, chalky bars the Hitler Youth sometimes received as rewards. Real chocolate, American chocolate, Hershey's. "For the boy," the soldier said in English, then again more slowly. "For the boy." He placed it on the kitchen table. Klaus stared at it. His mind couldn't process what he was seeing. In Nazi Germany, American chocolate was a myth. It was something from a dead capitalist world. His teachers had told him that American soldiers didn't share. They took. They conquered. They enslaved. But this man was leaving chocolate. Klaus's mother was crying silently. Her hand was on his shoulder, trembling. "You have food?" the younger soldier asked. He had more German, Klaus realized. "You need food." Klaus's mother pointed to their cupboard. Empty. Had been empty for weeks. Both soldiers exchanged a look. The older one nodded. He called down the street in English. Within minutes, a truck pulled up. American soldiers unloaded crates, real crates, filled with metal containers. Canned food, powdered milk, chocolate, cigarettes, soap. One of the containers was placed on their table. "Rations," the older soldier said. "For you, for the mother. You understand. Essen." Klaus nodded slowly. Essen, food. Yes, he understood. "We are not animals," the soldier said slowly, each word deliberate. "We are soldiers, like you, but we follow. Orders. Different orders." Then they left. The tanks continued down the street. The grinding of metal faded into the distance. Klaus and his mother stood in the kitchen staring at the crate and the chocolate bar. They didn't. Klaus's mother couldn't finish the sentence. Klaus picked up the chocolate. It was real. The wrapper felt like material from another world. He opened it slowly and broke off a piece. The taste was impossible. It was sweet and smooth and rich in a way he'd never experienced. It was, he would later understand, the taste of a lie collapsing. The chocolate was just the beginning. Within hours, Klaus would discover that everything the Nazi regime had told him about American soldiers was false. And worse, what they'd told him was true, came with evidence so shocking it would break something inside him. The next morning, Klaus woke to the sound of American military vehicles passing through the town. They didn't come to occupy harshly. They came to organize. Engineers, medical personnel, quartermasters, administrative officers. Klaus watched from the upstairs window as soldiers began removing rubble from the streets. They were clearing paths for ambulances. They were setting up a medical station in what used to be the town square, a large tent with red crosses painted on the sides. His mother had gone to investigate. When she returned, her eyes were red from crying. "They have doctors," she said numbly. "Real doctors, with medicines. Klaus, they're treating everyone, Germans too." Klaus didn't understand at first. In Nazi propaganda films, enemy soldiers were depicted as brutal, sadistic creatures who would kill rather than heal. The message had been simple and drummed into him relentlessly. The enemy wants you dead. All of you. Your families. Your race. But the evidence was mounting. The chocolate. The food. The generators they were running to provide electricity. The water they'd brought in huge tanks to clean the wells of typhus contamination. And then came the day Klaus witnessed the spike moment that would break something inside him. A moment of such impossible contradiction that his young mind couldn't reconcile it with anything he'd been taught. Across the street lived Herr Reinhardt, an old man who had worked in the local administration before the party took over. He'd been shot by an SS officer during the chaos of the collapse, a bullet in his leg, severely infected. His wife had been certain he was dying. There was no medicine. There was nothing. Klaus watched as an American medic, a private named Chen, carried Herr Reinhardt to the medical tent. The man was fevered, delirious. His leg had turned black from the infection. Later that afternoon, Klaus's mother ran into Chen while fetching water. "The old man?" she asked in broken English. "He will die." Chen smiled. "No, we have penicillin, American penicillin. He will be fine." Penicillin. Klaus had heard the word before in his chemistry lessons. A new miracle drug, supposedly. The Germans had been developing it, but production was slow and the stocks were reserved for the Wehrmacht. The idea of having enough penicillin that American soldiers could use it to treat German civilians seemed like a fantasy. But 3 weeks later, Herr Reinhardt walked down the street with a cane. Walking. Alive. The infection was gone. More evidence came in the form of logistics that Klaus couldn't understand. American trucks arrived with medical equipment, not field hospital equipment, but advanced machines, an X-ray machine, electroencephalographs, refrigeration units specifically designed to preserve blood and medications. Klaus overheard American officers discussing medical protocol with German doctors they'd brought in to help. They were talking about X-rays for all wounded, about using anesthesia for surgeries, about protocols for infection prevention that seemed almost luxurious in their attention to detail. Why? Klaus asked his mother. Why do they care if a German lives or dies? His mother had no answer. For Klaus, it was becoming clear that either his teachers had lied to him or his understanding of what was happening was fundamentally wrong. Enemies didn't bring penicillin. Enemies didn't set up field hospitals for civilians. Enemies didn't risk the lives of their own medics to treat infectious diseases. Unless the propaganda had been backwards. Unless the system that raised him had been the true monster. But the destruction of Klaus's worldview was just beginning. In 3 days, he would see something that would make him question not just the propaganda, but the very foundation of everything he'd been taught about race, superiority, and human dignity. 5 days after the Americans arrived, they ordered all civilians to gather in the town square. Klaus's mother was nervous about it. Gathering could mean execution or conscription into slave labor or anything. But resistance wasn't possible. About 800 people assembled, standing in the spring drizzle. American soldiers were setting up a large portable screen, a projector. This was going to be a film, Klaus realized. The American commander stood on an improvised stage. He was a captain, probably in his 30s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "I know you've been told lies," he said through an interpreter. "I know your government has told you we are monsters. I know you've been taught that we seek your destruction. I need you to understand the truth." He gestured to the projector operator. The photographs began to appear on the screen. The first image was from Dachau concentration camp. Bodies. Hundreds of bodies stacked like cordwood. Skeletal remains of human beings. Klaus felt his stomach convulse. He wanted to look away but couldn't. His mother's hand found his. She was trembling. The photographs kept coming. The images from Buchenwald, the gas chambers at Auschwitz, the crematoriums, the medical experiments, the children who had been murdered in their thousands. And underneath each photograph, a caption. "This was built by your government. This was done in your name. This was the dream your Fuhrer had for the world." Klaus's mind fractured. For 3 years, he had marched in the Hitler Youth. For 3 years, he had learned about the racial superiority of the Aryan people. For 3 years, he had been taught that the Jews were subhumans who deserved their fate. The Hitler Youth leaders had told him that the propaganda about camps was just enemy lies. British lies. American lies. The camps, they said, were labor camps. Prisons for enemies of the state, nothing more. But here was the proof. Not from propaganda. From photographs taken by American soldiers who found these places, from German officers' records, from the camps themselves. When the screen went dark, the silence was absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Klaus looked around. He saw old men with tears streaming down their faces. He saw women who appeared to have aged years in the past hour. He saw children younger than him, confused and traumatized. That night, Klaus couldn't sleep. He lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, and realized he had a choice to make. He could accept that he had been lied to. He could accept that the system that had raised him, that had given him purpose and identity and belonging, was evil. He could accept that the Americans, the monsters in the propaganda films, were actually showing him mercy. They could have executed him. They could have enslaved his mother. They could have left them to starve. Instead, they gave them chocolate. They healed their neighbors. They showed them the truth. Or he could convince himself that it was all a trick, that the photographs were fake, that this was psychological warfare, which, of course, it was, that none of it was real. Klaus realized something then that felt both profound and terrifying. The Nazis had been telling him about psychological warfare for years. They'd taught him that the enemy would use lies and manipulation to break the German spirit. They'd warned him that the Allies would try to demoralize them with false evidence and emotional manipulation. And Klaus understood in that moment why the Nazi regime had been so desperate to keep him from meeting American soldiers. Because the psychological warfare that worked wasn't photographs or speeches or leaflets. It was the simple fact that an American soldier had handed him chocolate and asked nothing in return. It was the fact that penicillin, rationed carefully to American soldiers themselves, was being used to save the life of an old German civilian. Because this American soldier, Private Chen, had orders to treat all patients equally, regardless of nationality. It was mercy. And mercy destroyed everything the Nazi regime stood for. But for Klaus, the real test was still to come. Because destruction of belief was easy. Rebuilding what you believed was the hard part. And in the weeks ahead, Klaus would see that the Americans weren't just defeating Nazis. They were trying to teach a new way of being human. April 20th, 1945 to May 8th, 1945. The liberation, because that's what it was starting to feel like, liberation rather than occupation, brought more than soldiers. It brought engineers. American Army engineers with plans and supplies, and a mandate from General Dwight D. Eisenhower himself. The orders had been clear: win the peace through reconstruction, show the German people that American abundance could rebuild what war destroyed, prove that cooperation brought reward, break the Nazi myth by replacing it with a new one, the myth of American generosity and the possibility of normal life. Klaus watched as American soldiers began the work. First, they cleared the rubble from the streets, methodically, carefully, reclaiming the town's infrastructure. Then came the engineers with plans. The destroyed bridge across the local river would be rebuilt. They had modular steel truss construction, revolutionary, efficient, fast. Klaus volunteered to help. Nobody forced him. He simply woke up one morning and realized he wanted to be part of rebuilding rather than destroying. Private Chen, the medic who had saved Herr Reinhardt, noticed Klaus on the work crew. He was supervising sanitation arrangements, making sure the water was clean, teaching German workers about typhus prevention. He greeted Klaus with a smile. "You learn English?" Chen asked. "A little," Klaus replied carefully. "You teach?" Chen laughed. "Sure, why not? Your English is not so bad." Over the following weeks, Klaus worked alongside American soldiers, not as an enemy, not as a prisoner, but as a worker helping rebuild. And slowly, carefully, Chen began to explain things. "Why does America help?" Klaus asked one day. "Why give food to enemies?" Chen sat down on a pile of rubble. He was smoking, something Klaus still found exotic. "Is not about enemies," Chen said carefully. "You know what my mother said? My mother is Chinese. In China, many Americans did bad things. The Japanese, too. But my mother said, hatred breeds only more hatred. If we want a different world, we must start by treating people as people." Klaus didn't fully understand, but he was beginning to. Over the following weeks, more evidence accumulated. The Americans organized schools. They brought in German teachers, carefully vetted, ideologically neutral, but actual German educators. The curriculum was different now. No racial science, no Hitler Youth ideology, but also not some strange American indoctrination. Just education, history, math, literature. Klaus was allowed to attend. At 15, with the formal schooling system collapsed, he went to class with 8-year-olds and other teenagers displaced by the war. The American officer overseeing education was a former teacher from Ohio named Lieutenant Morrison. "We are not here to make you American," Morrison told the class. "We are here to help you become German citizens again, not Nazi Germans, but real Germans. People who think for themselves, people who value truth over propaganda." The books were different. Klaus read German poetry again, not just the Nazi-approved works, but Goethe and Schiller, and Heine, the Jewish poet whose works had been burned by the Nazis. Reading Hina felt like a confession and an opening at the same time. He was allowed to read prohibited books. The world didn't end. Then came the day that crystallized everything for Klaus. A young German girl, maybe 7 years old, came into the medical station with a severely infected wound on her leg. She'd stepped on contaminated metal during the demolition work. Blood poisoning was setting in. Klaus was there, helping carry supplies. He watched as Dr. Friedrich Müller, a German physician working with the Americans, examined the wound. "She needs surgery," Dr. Müller said to Private Chen. "The infection has spread into the muscle. Without amputation, she will die." Klaus's heart sank. Amputation. Another child lost. Another life destroyed. But Chen shook his head. "We have 70 doses of penicillin allocated for this sector. The girl gets priority. 70 doses. Klaus had never heard of that much penicillin in one place. In Nazi Germany, penicillin was so rare that entire hospitals had to fight for a few vials. They didn't amputate. They treated the infection with massive doses of penicillin. They kept her sedated with morphine. They performed surgery carefully, removing only the infected tissue, saving the limb. Klaus watched it all. He saw the American medical team work with precision and care. He saw Dr. Müller working alongside Private Chen, not as occupier and occupied, but as colleagues united in a single goal, saving a child's life. 3 weeks later, the girl walked out of the medical station. She limped, but she walked. She had both legs. Klaus approached Dr. Müller afterwards. "Why?" he asked. "Why does America do this? Why so much medicine for one German girl?" Dr. Müller, an older man with deep lines on his face, took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Because they have chosen mercy," he said quietly. "It is unprecedented. In this war, both sides have chosen cruelty. The Nazis chose cruelty as policy. The Russians choose cruelty as revenge. But these Americans, they choose mercy as policy. It is so different, so shocking, that we don't know how to respond. Doctor?" Müller put his glasses back on and looked at Klaus seriously. "Klaus, do you understand what you are witnessing? This is not normal. This is not how wars end. Wars end with vengeance and destruction. But this occupation is ending with reconstruction. The question now is, will we learn from it?" Klaus didn't answer, but he knew what Dr. Müller meant. By May 1945, Klaus had learned something that no textbook could have taught him. He had learned that ideology could be defeated not by counter-ideology, but by human kindness backed by overwhelming material abundance. And he had learned that the choice before him now was not between competing systems, but between mercy and revenge, and that those who chose mercy won something deeper than any military victory. One afternoon in early May, Klaus was helping American soldiers unload a supply truck when Lieutenant Morrison found him. "Klaus, come with me," Morrison said. "I want to show you something." They walked to the American command post, set up in what used to be the town's administrative building. Morrison brought Klaus to a map of the region and beyond. "Do you understand what you are looking at?" Morrison asked. Klaus shook his head. "This is the logistical network of the United States Army," Morrison said. "We have supply lines stretching from the Atlantic Ocean, ships bringing food, medicine, ammunition, fuel, trucks, and every single thing needed to support 3 million soldiers. The scale is incomprehensible." He pointed to different symbols on the map. "The Nazis believed in scarcity," Morrison continued. "That's the core of everything they taught. There is not enough. We must take from others. We must dominate to survive. It justifies everything: slavery, genocide, endless war." Morrison pointed to another document, a supply manifest. "The United States has chosen the opposite philosophy. We have such abundance that we can afford to be generous. We can share. We can rebuild. We can treat enemies as human beings because we don't need to fear that feeding you means starving us." Klaus was trying to understand. "It is not compassion that makes us act this way," Morrison said. "Not entirely, anyway. It is also strategy. We discovered that kindness is more effective than brutality. That showing mercy breaks the enemy's will to resist more effectively than any bomb. Your propaganda told you we were subhumans. Now you see that is false. Your propaganda told you we were weak. Now you see that is false too. A nation that is truly strong can afford to be merciful. Klaus was beginning to understand something revolutionary. The Americans hadn't defeated the Nazis through superior firepower alone, though they had that. They had defeated them through superior philosophy. The Nazis believed in scarcity and domination. The Americans believed in abundance and cooperation. And in a world of limited resources, maybe scarcity and domination would win. But in a world of industrial abundance, mercy was more powerful than cruelty. May 1945. By the time Germany officially surrendered on May 8, 1945, Klaus had undergone a transformation that would have been unimaginable 2 months earlier. He had gone from a uniformed Nazi zealot to a skeptic of everything he'd been taught. But he wasn't yet. What? A believer in American democracy. A convert to capitalism. He wasn't entirely sure what he believed anymore. What he knew was this: the propaganda had been a lie. The system that raised him was built on cruelty and delusion, and the people he'd been taught to hate had treated him with more kindness than he'd ever experienced under the regime that claimed to represent him. The American military called a town meeting. All citizens were encouraged to attend. Klaus and his mother went. An American major stood before them and made a remarkable speech. "I know you are afraid," the major said through an interpreter. "I know you've been told that we are here to punish you, to enslave you, to make you pay for the sins of your government. Some of you have committed crimes. Those will be tried in courts of law. But most of you are citizens who lived under a dictatorship. You had no choice. You had no freedom. You could not refuse the Hitler Youth. You could not refuse the war." The major gestured broadly. "We are here to help you rebuild, to help you remember what it means to be German. Real German, not Nazi German. The Americans and British believe that Germany can return to civilization. We are investing in that belief. We are spending billions of dollars, thousands of soldiers' lives, years of effort to rebuild, not just roads and bridges, but your ability to choose for yourselves." Klaus felt something break inside him, not in a bad way, in a way that felt like healing. "We need your help now. I'm going to tell you about something important, something I'll explain more fully in our next meeting. But first, if you're watching this story, I want to ask you something important. If you believe that history matters, if you believe that the stories of ordinary people facing extraordinary choices deserve to be remembered, please subscribe. Because we have more stories like this, stories of courage, stories of transformation, stories of what happens when ordinary humans choose kindness over cruelty, mercy over revenge. Subscribe now, and you'll get to see these stories as they're released. You'll be part of preserving history. You'll be part of ensuring that future generations understand what it means to choose humanity in moments of darkness. Klaus was invited to work in the American administration. His English had improved. His mind was sharp. And they needed translators who could help bridge the gap between occupier and occupied. Over the following months, Klaus learned more than he could have imagined. He learned about the Marshall Plan, the American commitment to rebuild all of Europe. He learned about democracy. He learned that nations could compete without trying to exterminate each other. He learned that the world was vastly more complex, more nuanced, and more hopeful than Nazi ideology had permitted him to believe. But more importantly, he learned about himself. He learned that he could think for himself. He learned that challenging what he'd been taught wasn't treason. It was growing up. He learned that courage wasn't about dying for a cause. Sometimes courage was admitting you'd been wrong. In June 1945, Klaus was invited to meet with Private Chen again. They sat in the town square on a bench overlooking the rebuilt bridge. "You have thought about your future?" Chen asked. Klaus nodded. "I want to study, to go to university, to understand the world properly." "Good," Chen said. "America will help with this. We have a program for German students. You can come to America, study, learn, become what you wish to become." Klaus was quiet for a moment. Then he asked the question that had haunted him since April. Was it propaganda, the kindness? Was it strategy? Chen smiled sadly. Does it matter? He asked. If the strategy was to show you that kindness works better than cruelty, then yes, it was strategic. But the strategy was backed by real resources, real doctors, real medicine, real food. The kindness was real, even if it was also strategy. Klaus understood then. The Americans weren't angels. They had strategic interests. They were trying to win Klaus's mind as much as they were trying to save his life. But the fact that their strategy was to show mercy rather than cruelty, to rebuild rather than destroy, to offer hope rather than despair, that made all the difference. By summer 1945, Klaus Bergmann was rebuilding a life in a new world. He didn't know it yet, but he would eventually become a professor. He would spend his life teaching German students about history, about how propaganda works, about how to recognize manipulation. But first, he had to understand something about the power of his own transformation. August 1945. 2 months after the war ended, Klaus was walking through town with his mother when he noticed something that froze him in place. A group of young German boys, 12, 13, 14 years old, were playing in the street. They were flying kites. American kites that had been given to them by GIs. They were laughing. Free, unkempt. No uniforms, no formations, no ideology. It struck Klaus with sudden force. This is what we lost. This is what the Nazis took from us. The simple right to be children, to play without purpose, to exist without serving a greater cause. That night, Klaus sat down and wrote in a journal. Reichsleiter Bormann told us that to be German is to be strong, to be martial, to be ready to die for the fatherland. But today I watched children play, truly play, for the first time. They were more German than any Hitler Youth formation ever was. They were free. Klaus was beginning to understand something profound. The Nazis had believed they were elevating the German people. In reality, they had been diminishing them. They had taken human beings and tried to turn them into machines. They had taken imagination and replaced it with dogma. They had taken individual thought and replaced it with collective ideology. The Americans, for all their flaws, had come with a different philosophy, not perfection, not even always kindness, but a belief that individual human beings mattered, that thought mattered, that choice mattered. And in that belief, the Nazis were defeated. What Klaus didn't know in August 1945 was that his story was being replicated across Bavaria, across Germany, across the entire occupied zone. Thousands of young people were undergoing similar transformations, and this was precisely the point. The Americans had realized that defeating an ideology wasn't about killing soldiers or destroying infrastructure. It was about reaching the next generation and offering them something better. In the years after 1945, a profound shift occurred in Germany. The reconstruction efforts began to take shape. Schools were rebuilt, universities reopened, newspapers were published without Nazi censorship, radio stations broadcast news without propaganda. Klaus wasn't unique in his transformation, though his story was remarkable. Across Germany, young people who had been raised in the Hitler Youth were suddenly confronted with the reality of what they'd been taught. Some, like Klaus, embraced the opportunity to learn and grow. Others struggled with the cognitive dissonance. A few never accepted that they'd been wrong. But the majority slowly began to rebuild themselves and their society. The Marshall Plan, announced in 1948, represented the ultimate expression of this philosophy. Rather than punishing Germany, as they had been punished after World War I, the Americans invested $13 billion in rebuilding Western Europe. Germany received 10 to 15% of that aid. American soldiers stayed. American businesses invested. American universities opened their doors to German students. It was, in historical perspective, an extraordinary gamble. The traditional response to military defeat was punishment and reparations. The Americans tried something different. They tried mercy backed by material abundance. And if Klaus's journey toward breaking free from propaganda resonates with you, if the idea that one simple act of kindness can shatter an entire system of lies touches something deep in your heart, then like this video. Because stories like this matter. They remind us that history isn't just about the victories of militaries and the ambitions of leaders. It's about moments when ordinary humans chose to be human, and that choice changed everything. Klaus eventually made it to university. He studied history and philosophy. He eventually became a professor at the University of Munich. In the 1950s and 60s, he taught thousands of students about what it meant to fall under totalitarian control and what it took to escape it. He lived to see the Berlin Wall fall. He lived to see Germany reunified. He lived to see former enemies become partners in a unified Europe. And he never stopped talking about the chocolate. That chocolate bar, he would tell his students, was worth more than any military campaign. It proved that mercy was possible. It proved that the enemy was human. It proved that ideology could be shattered by kindness. In 1998, at the age of 74, Klaus was invited to speak at a university in California. While there, he was reunited with Private Chen, now Dr. Chen, retired from medicine after a long career. They sat together, two old men, and Klaus asked a question he'd carried his entire life. "Do you remember me? Do you remember the village? Do you remember that you gave us food?" Dr. Chen smiled. "I remember. I remember many villages. I remember many children. I tried to teach them that American soldiers were human, that we were not monsters. I tried to teach them that you could treat people with mercy and still be strong." "Did you know it would work?" Klaus asked. "Did you know that it would shatter the propaganda?" "I hoped," Chen said. "That was all we could do. We hoped that if we showed enough kindness, if we shared enough resources, if we treated German people as human beings, eventually the lies would collapse. We didn't know if it would work. But we knew the alternative, revenge and punishment, had failed after World War I. We decided to try something different." Klaus thought about the young American soldier of 1945. He thought about the chocolate. He thought about the penicillin, the food, the rebuilt bridges, the schools, the universities. "You were right," Klaus said finally. "It worked." What Klaus Bergman teaches us 80 years later is something we desperately need to remember. In 1945, Europe was shattered. Tens of millions were dead. Cities were ruins. The entire civilizational order had collapsed. The easy response would have been revenge. The natural human response would have been retribution. But a small group of American leaders, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and later Harry Truman, and thousands of ordinary soldiers made a different choice. They chose to believe that people could change. They chose to believe that ideology was fragile. They chose to believe that mercy, backed by material abundance and institutional support, could defeat hatred, and they were right. The chocolate bar that Klaus received in April 1945 didn't just feed his body, it fed his hope. It reminded him that another way of being was possible. It proved that the propaganda had been wrong. In the decades that followed, that choice to rebuild rather than punish, to educate rather than dominate, to treat former enemies as future partners, transformed Germany and by extension the entire world. Western Germany became a thriving democracy. It became economically prosperous. It became a place where Jews could live safely. It became a nation that, despite its history of atrocity, managed to build something new. None of that was guaranteed. None of it was inevitable. Klaus lived to see it all. He lived to see the wall fall. He lived to see Germany reunified. He lived to see his nation, which had committed genocide, manage to transform itself through education, accountability, and national reckoning. And he always said that it started with chocolate. What Klaus's story reveals is that propaganda is fragile. Nazi ideology, built on racial superiority, militant strength, and the glorification of death, collapsed almost instantly when confronted with a different reality. It collapsed when young people were treated as human. It collapsed when resources were shared. It collapsed when the future was offered as possibility rather than duty. 80 years later, we live in a world filled with propaganda of all kinds. Political propaganda, consumer propaganda, social media manipulation designed to turn us against each other. But Klaus's story reminds us of something essential. We still have the power to choose. We still have the power to reject lies. We still have the power to demand mercy, generosity, and treatment as human beings rather than ideological tools. And perhaps most importantly, we have the power to extend that mercy to others, to recognize that people can change, to believe in transformation, to understand that sometimes a bar of chocolate, or a kind word, or a genuine gesture of human connection can accomplish what no weapon ever could. Klaus died in 2006 at the age of 83. His memorial service was attended by hundreds of his students, many of them now professors themselves. They spoke about how he had taught them to think critically, to question authority, to value truth over ideology. But they also spoke about what his life meant. Here was a man who had been indoctrinated into one of history's greatest evils. Here was a man who had worn the uniform of the Hitler Youth. And here was a man who, through exposure to mercy and kindness, had transformed into a voice for peace, education, and human dignity. If that could happen in 1945 in the rubble of a defeated nation, facing everything a propagandized child had been taught to fear, then transformation is possible. Hope is possible. Change is possible. That is the ultimate victory. Not the military victory of the Allies, not even the philosophical victory over Nazi ideology. The ultimate victory is the possibility of change itself. The recognition that even in our darkest moments, even when everything we've been taught is proven false, even when the world collapses around us, we can choose differently. We can accept chocolate from the person we've been taught to hate. We can allow our worldview to be shattered. We can build something new. Klaus Bergmann's chocolate bar wasn't just a moment in history. It was a symbol of what becomes possible when we refuse hatred and embrace mercy. And that story, that possibility, is one worth telling again and again and again. If this story moved you, if the idea that ordinary humans can reject propaganda and choose humanity resonates with you, then subscribe now, because we have more stories like this. Stories of people who faced impossible choices and chose the human path. Stories of how kindness defeats hatred. Stories of how the future isn't determined by our past, but by the choices we make in the present. Subscribe, share, remember, because history isn't just something that happened to other people in other times. It's a reflection of who we are and who we choose to become. The chocolate bar that Klaus received 80 years ago is gone. It was consumed on that cold April day in 1945. But its meaning, the meaning of mercy, of human connection, of refusing to see the enemy as inhuman, that lives on. And it can live on in us, in our choices, in the world we create together. Thank you for listening to the story of Klaus Bergmann and the chocolate that shattered a myth.